Friends, colleagues, good afternoon. Merci d'être parmi nous pour cette...
Thank you for being with us for this special, unique opportunity that aims to advance dialogue and indeed to implement proposals for action so that we can adapt to the climate change crisis.
Darren Gilmour, and I'm the Executive Director of the Royal Society of Canada. I have the opportunity to introduce today's keynote speaker, Natan Obed, President of Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami. Natan is originally from Nain, the northernmost community of Labrador's Nunavut region. For 10 years, he lived in Iqaluit, Nunavut, and worked as the Director of Social and Cultural Development for Nunavut Tungavik Incorporated, the organization that represents the rights of Nunavut Inuit. He has devoted his career to working with Inuit representational organizations to improve the well-being of Inuit in Canada. I met Natan 6 years ago in Iqaluit. During those initial encounters, Natan was gracious in gently but firmly guiding my engagement with Inuit in Inuit Nunangat. A few months later, in the fall of 2015, Natan was elected president of ITK, and I had occasion to introduce him at a public policy event. Several colleagues were in touch following that event to describe their sense of having observed a new kind of leadership. At the time, that was my sense too. And that sense has only deepened since then. Though it's not my role to assess achievement, Natan's term from 2015 to 2018 as ITK president was punctuated by objectively impressive organizational outcomes. I cite 4, among many others. First, the establishment of the Inuit Crown Partnership Committee, which has provided a new and effective forum for high-level decision-making. The work of that committee has continued since its establishment. Second, for the first time in Budget 2018, there was an Inuit-specific section that outlined investments in eliminating tuberculosis, advancing a permanent Inuit health survey, and housing. During this time, ITK also secured a commitment from the federal government to work with Inuit regions on eliminating tuberculosis in northern communities by 2030. Third, the National Inuit Strategy on Research was released in early 2018, the year when Canada was president of the G7. In March of that year, the RSC organized the first of these events, G7 Research Summits. And the event was highlighted by the presentation of the research strategy to attendees and a keynote by Natan. To this day, I have colleagues who recall the address Natan delivered at the Arctic Sustainability Summit in Montreal and their feeling of having witnessed a new kind of leadership. Natan's recent election to a third term as president of ITK affords an opportunity to take stock of organizational achievements during his second term from 2018 to 2021. These include the Inuit Nunangat Housing Strategy and the National Inuit Climate Change Strategy, as well as a greater shift toward rebuilding the relationship between Inuit and Canada through an apology from then Minister Bennett to the Ahiarmiut of Enadai Lake, and an apology from Prime Minister Trudeau for Inuit mistreatment during the tuberculosis epidemic in the 1950s. As the COVID-19 pandemic arrived to Canada ITK's advocacy and mobilization efforts contributed to a strong response in Inuit Nunangat, and these efforts have continued unabated. Within the past year, ITK has made central contributions, resulting in the adoption by Parliament of legislation toward implementing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Also, within the past year, ITK published the Inuit Nunangat Food Security Strategy and launched 2 new research initiatives. Natan and ITK have also continually encouraged Canadians from coast to coast to coast to recognize that using another culture or ethnic identity for entertainment is unacceptable. ITK was founded in 1971 in November, and just a few weeks before its 50th birthday, Mary Simon was appointed to the office of Governor General, the first Indigenous person to hold that role. Now, Natan would hasten to note that ITK's remarkable organizational achievements of the past 6 years, of which I have cited only a portion, have not resulted from the efforts of one individual. They've been collective. And while much has been accomplished, there is an immense amount of profoundly challenging work requiring urgent focus. Still, even for endurance athletes like Natan, it is worthwhile to occasionally and briefly look over one's shoulder to reassure oneself that useful work has been done. And then the eyes turn back forward and the work continues. Today, Natan has kindly accepted to return to an RSC G7 Research Summit 3.5 years after his last keynote in this forum to offer reflections on ensuring a just transition to net zero. In thanking him for doing this, on behalf of Society of Canada, our warm congratulations to ITK on its 50th birthday. The organization shines ever more brightly to the benefit of all. I suspect that in learning from Natan today, you too may sense that you are witnessing a new kind of leadership. Friends, colleagues, chers collègues, the president of Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami, Natan Obed.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Darren, for your very thoughtful introduction. I'm honored to be here as ITK president, and also just honored to be, Darren, your friend. So thank you so much for that introduction. And yes, it isn't my strong suit sometimes to look over my shoulder. And so thank you so much for putting into very clear terms some of the things that have happened over the last 6 years at ITK. We have been very fortunate at ITK to have a government with a reconciliation agenda that has worked with Inuit on a number of very important issues. There still is so much work to do, but there is optimism at this point in time that we have a government that is, and a population in the country that is interested in reconciliation, interested in Inuit Nunangat, the Canadian Inuit homeland, and also, imagining Canada in a very different way. It starts, I suppose, with imagining Canada with the Arctic attached to it. I'll get into a lot of these conversations and then link them to climate change and the need for climate action and a just transition. But I want to start by talking a little bit about ITK. Inuit have a governance model that sits alongside the municipal, provincial, territorial, and federal governance models that I'm sure all of you are very familiar with. Perhaps some of you have been elected leaders in your time or have served for these particular institutions. Canadians often think of Indigenous governance as a very different type of reality, something that perhaps isn't comparable in any way to the provincial, territorial, or federal systems. And perhaps when you hear about Indigenous issues or you hear a particular Indigenous person speaking, you perhaps do not have that same understanding of an Indigenous governance model and an Indigenous leadership group, a rights holding group, making positions clear versus individuals who perhaps have very strong opinions. So I wanted to start by just saying that ITK is the representational organization for Canada's 65,000 Inuit. There are 4 land claim regions that each have modern treaties with the Government of Canada. Nunatsiavut in Northern Labrador, Nunavik in Northern Quebec, Nunavut, which is also a jurisdiction created by a land claim agreement. Article 4 of the Nunavut Agreement are basically the birthing papers for that particular jurisdiction. And then the Inuvialuit region in the northern part of the Northwest Territories. Each one of these land claim regions has an organization that is a birthright organization, land claims organization. So there are beneficiaries that are enlisted under each of the 4 land claim regions. And each one of those beneficiaries, once they reach the age of 16, can vote then in democratic elections for their leadership. Those 4 presidents of, and in the Inuvialuit, it's a chair and CEO, and that's Dwayne Smith. They sit as the board of directors for Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami. Therefore, I don't get elected based on my own platform or a party platform. I get elected based on the ability that I have to implement the ITK board of director resolutions or particular direction that comes from the 4 land claim regions. So when ITK puts out a press release, or when we create a strategy, or I make official remarks such as these, I'm not speaking as an individual. I'm also not speaking as a particular party that is in control of a particular institution. I am speaking on behalf of the interests of Inuit in Canada. This becomes increasingly difficult in the 21st century, especially as more and more Inuit leave Inuit Nunangat and live in southern Canada, and also as political interests fracture and as there are more divisive challenges that we all face in our governance models. A large part of my job is to keep Inuit unity and to ensure that the positions that ITK takes are ones that are truly representative of the Inuit collective. That also means that you may meet an individual Inuk from time to time that has a very different position or opinion than the ITK positions that are brought forward here today, or that are in our strategies or in our public statements. I would say that is exactly the case across every governance model in Canada. There are many people here in Ontario that perhaps have very different opinions about what the government of Ontario should do, or the positions that the government of Ontario takes, than they personally would take themselves. That does not mean that the Premier loses his right to govern based on one particular member of that jurisdiction disagreeing with him. That often is something that Canadians are willing to accept when they encounter an Indigenous person with a differing perspective than an Indigenous institution. So I just wanted to pause here because I had a bit of time, and also because it's so important within this conversation to understand who is speaking and for what purpose. We all can have opinions, and this world needs activism and individual leadership just as much as it needs collective leadership and governance leadership and jurisdictional leadership. We all form a whole, and we all do our particular part within it. But it is good to be self-conscious or self-aware of who we are listening to and how we catalog that particular information, and then how we use it in the world, and use it to support one another or support, in the work that we do, support Inuit. The 4 settlement areas of our land claim agreements are approximately a third of Canada's landmass. And so Inuit have either complete ownership or have mechanisms of co-management over a third of Canada. Within that third, there's between 65 and 70% of Canada's coastline. So the majority of Canada's coastline is within Inuit Nunangat, and Inuit Nunangat is co-managed through these 4 land claim agreements, and then other mechanisms that have been created in relation to the implementation of our existing Indigenous rights, to form an area of this country that is governed in partnership between the federal government, provinces and territories, and Inuit. There are only 65,000 Inuit in Canada, and a number of Inuit live outside of Inuit Nunangat. We are still the majority population in each one of our 51 communities across Inuit Nunangat, and in most of our communities, the mother tongue still is Inuktitut, which is the term that we use to describe all of the dialects of our language. Inuktitut is a dialect of Inuktitut. It's a completely different space than most of southern Canada. There are only 2 roads. There is a road, there are only 2 communities connected to all-weather roads. One in Inuvik, and then there is the road that then continues on now to Tuktoyaktuk. So consider that across our 51 communities, there are only 5 that are on a marine ferry service. And that all of our communities are either on rivers, lakes, or in the marine catchment area. We have such a dearth of infrastructure that is a result of, one, the challenges of geography, but 2, the colonial nature of our relationship with Canada, and 3, then just the inability to find the political will to alleviate the discrepancies that we face in our communities, the inequities in relation to infrastructure, in relation to housing, in relation to healthcare and education. A lot of our communities are quite young. It was only after World War II and in the Cold War era that the federal government created policies that either relocated Inuit or coerced Inuit into living in Southern-style settlement areas. In the past, Inuit were seasonal. We had very specific places where we belong in the world, but we spent certain times of the year on on land and some on the sea ice and some on islands in different parts of our homeland based on where the shelter was best, where the resources for food and water were best, and also based on our families and our kinship and our traditional ties. So our lives are very different than they were 50 years ago. And the forming of ITK in 71 is a reminder of just how far we've come. There's been lots of conversation about Inuit going from the Stone Age to the digital age in 50 years. I don't necessarily like to put that type of spin on it. I just imagine that the way that we live our lives is very different. But the grounding of our traditional knowledge, of our societal cohesion, of our relationship with one another, and our values in the world continues to be a constant throughout all of the things that have happened to Inuit. We find ourselves in another crisis. The colonial period was a time of crisis for us in our culture and society, our language, the well-being of our population, our children, our education, the ability to practice our culture. But we have now persevered and created self-governance mechanisms and constructive arrangements with Canada to ensure our well-being and ensure that we have access to decision-making and agency within the governance models that exist in this country. But the climate crisis that is upon us is a new kind of crisis. It has the ability to be just as disruptive and just as devastating as some of the challenges that we had faced in the colonial period, especially in relation to our own well-being, the continuity of our culture, of our language, of our traditional practices. Not only are we facing challenges in understanding our environment and understanding seasonal weather patterns so as to stay safe when we travel within our homeland, but we also face rising costs in relation to having a home, in relation to the price, the cost of going on the land, and trying to do all that we can to keep a traditional way of life, while the certainty that is created by our knowledge is eroding underfoot. We have already experienced 2.2 degrees Celsius warming over our traditional levels. So we are already beyond the goals set out in the Paris Agreement. We have already seen massive changes in the physical environment. We have also seen changes in relation to wildlife distribution and wildlife health. We rely heavily on sea ice as a mode of transportation. These places are our highways for the majority of the year. But then also they provide us access to traditional hunting grounds, traditional places where seasonally we would camp and live with our families. And also the basic risk of losing our lives or injuring ourselves when on the land. There have been some very high profile cases of Inuit falling through the sea ice on trails and places where we have traveled for millennia and that have always been known to be safe at the particular times of year where people have run into trouble. We also see more extreme weather events. There are changes in the warmth of the ocean water during the course of the year. There are changes in glaciers. There is tremendous permafrost thaw in certain places that traditionally there were not. And all of this creates immense challenges for us within our communities, especially when all of our infrastructure is built with permafrost in mind. There are many communities that aren't built on bedrock, they're built on permafrost. If you've ever been to Inuit Nunangat, especially in Nunavut and Nunavik, you will see that most of the houses are elevated from the earth, so that everything's on stilts. And that is because of the natural shift in permafrost and the inability to lay concrete foundations directly on top of permafrost. As our summers become more intense and as permafrost thaws, we are going to have much greater issues with our infrastructure than we ever have before. We also are going to have more challenges in relation to water and the ability to access fresh drinking water, and then the infrastructure that supports that water getting to individuals and communities. We see what's going on in British Columbia in the national news this week, and can't help but think about some of these terrible changes that are coming at us in the South that have already started in the Arctic. And it's up to Inuit not just to be the canaries in the coal mine in this conversation. Transitioning into a just transition also means that we have to be policy partners and we have to be political partners with governments and with the academic community to ensure that the Inuit positions in relation to climate action are considered in the same way that jurisdictional issues are considered, territorial or provincial issues are considered, or community-based issues are considered. The actions that we take as a country on climate policy also have massive ramifications on Inuit Nunangat. There is more that Canada can do to curb greenhouse gas emissions and to get to net zero. There are going to have to be shifts in the way we think of our economy. And there are some hard truths that I don't believe that Canada has told itself yet around energy production and around the aspirations and the goals that Canada has. Right now, Canada is still the fourth largest oil and gas producer in the world. And I know that it is a very tight balance that Canada plays in being a climate leader while also being in this particular extractive industry. We have created an Inuit Nunangat climate change strategy. The focus of that strategy is largely on adaptation and mitigation to climate change. We also focus again on climate action by nation states, and whether it be from the UN level or the Canadian level or the sub-national level. But first and foremost, we are concerned about things like coastal erosion in Tuktoyaktuk, where homes are literally washing into the sea. We are concerned about Inuit falling through the ice on traditional sea ice routes that we have traveled for millennia. We're concerned about permafrost thaw and the instability that creates within freshwater resources or within the natural environment for living things. We're concerned about vegetation change, and we're concerned about invasive species upsetting the balance in which we live and which all living things live. We're also concerned about the way in which our communities are considered in national and international action. The Canadian government has pledged $5.3 billion over 5 years to support climate finance in developing countries. We would like to see the Canadian government pledge considerably more funds for aspirational intent for our own communities, whether it's creating equitable infrastructure, transitioning our diesel power generation to more energy efficient and green options, or whether it's reimagining the transportation system so as to create less greenhouse gas emissions. There are many things that we would want to do with the federal government that we do not have the resources to do today. We also are concerned about our food, and we have created a number of different resources to consider the effect that country food and the inability to obtain country food has on our well-being, on our poverty levels, and our health. It's just in Nunavut alone, the annual harvest of country food equates to about $200 million of store purchased foods. In a reality where climate change cuts off a number of different options for us to harvest our traditional foods, or those traditional food sources are no longer present, we need to find creative solutions that are in keeping with our society, that are respectful of our place in the world, but also keep us healthy and keep us out of poverty. There are a whole host of other things that I could talk about. The work that we do with the academic community and with governments really is about partnership. It isn't necessarily about hearing all the terrible things and then going away and saying, well, I guess I'll have to do more things in my particular silo. What we're asking for is a new way of working and a partnership approach where the federal government, provincial and territorial governments, and all those who are leaders within the climate space allow for participation and reimagine Canada with the Arctic as a very considerable priority area within all of the climate action that happens towards a just transition. Nakomik, thank you very much for your time, and I really appreciate being a part of this today.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Natan, for that address. I'm Rick Smith, the president of the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices. Merci, Natan, for those important comments, for those hard truths, as you say. And I want to join Darren in wishing ITK a very happy 50th birthday. We're grateful for ITK's ongoing leadership, including in the area of climate change. Thank you for bringing us those comments today. Canadians, as you say, need to understand that the Arctic has already warmed beyond 2 degrees. And in your words, imagining Canada with the Arctic attached to it does mean acknowledging, mitigating, preventing further damaging climate change effects on Inuit communities. A just transition with Inuit rights acknowledged, with Inuit and other Indigenous peoples as key decision makers, is something that we all need to strive for. Recently, when I was in Glasgow last week, I think I have to say that one of the most exciting presentations I went to was on microgrids, renewable energy microgrids in Indigenous communities, and the multiple benefits that would result if those types of renewable energy infrastructure, if that was adequately funded and if that was pushed forward by our respective governments. So thank you again for those comments. I have the great duty of thanking everybody involved in this important event today. Thank you to our great panelists for their insights. And thank you to you, our viewers, for tuning in from across Canada and around the world. We had a great attendance today. Nous avons eu une belle participation aujourd'hui.
We had a wonderful participation today, attendance today. In the name of the Royal Canadian Society, I would like to thank you for having spent a few hours with us. We hope you found our today's discussion to be stimulating and useful for your own research programs.
Today's Royal Society of Canada G7 Research Summit focused on climate change implications and mitigation options for Canada, using the S7 statement on net zero as the catalyst for discussions. That statement, which was released in March of this year, around the time of the G7 meeting, could not have been clearer on the need for immediate climate change action. That statement reads, "Climate change is a real and present danger. Science tells us we must act now and continue to act into the future to deliver net zero emissions if we are to avoid unacceptable warming. This is the moment for the G7 member countries to demonstrate leadership and commit to drive forward mitigation of and adaptation to climate change," end quote. A consistent theme that we heard throughout our three sessions today is that it's possible and necessary to hold two thoughts in our head at the same time. The first is that we're making progress on the climate change challenge. Quite often with the climate change issue, there's this kind of doom and nihilism that creeps in, understandably. But a lot of our panelists today reminded us that this is a solvable problem. To a great extent, we know what needs to be done. As one example, some of the panelists spoke of the positive recent announcements at COP26 in Glasgow with respect to nature-based solutions, the necessary involvement of Indigenous peoples. As one instance here, the new commitment of 28 countries to end deforestation, a real step forward. But the second thought that we need to bear in mind is that we're not doing enough. And we heard a lot of our panelists reminding us of that today. The urgency of climate change dictates that we need to accelerate our activity, keeping warming to 1.5 degrees, especially if you're Canada, where many parts of our country have already warmed beyond that. 1.5 degrees isn't a nice to have, it's a must have. And we are not clearly on track at the moment. We know that climate change is driving more extreme weather, fires, flooding. Climate change is not a problem that's going to materialize tomorrow. It's something that's degrading our quality of life in the here and now. Another theme that emerged from the day was the need to both scale up technologies and approaches that are able to bring down carbon levels in the short term, what the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices has termed safe bets, as well as develop so-called wildcards, new technologies that will be necessary to bring down carbon levels, especially in the 2030 to 2050 period. This next year will be a critical time in our country's climate change mitigation and adaptation efforts to do all of these things. As laid out in the new Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act, the federal government must deliver the country's first 2030 emissions reduction plan, complete with details such as sectoral reduction targets for certain industries, early in 2022. Also in the next few months, the federal government is committed to creating a new national climate change adaptation strategy. And against the backdrop of today's terrible flooding in British Columbia, and we're thinking of our friends and family in British Columbia today, the imperative to get much better at climate adaptation planning and implementation could not be clearer. A year from now, the United Nations will convene the countries of the world at COP27 in Egypt. The world's nations have agreed this week to bring that meeting evidence of their improved carbon reduction performance. So the pressure is on like never before for Canada to deliver, and this climate change discussion needs all of us engaged to move it forward. The Royal Society of Canada's Celebration of Excellence and Engagement programming continues this week. I just wanted to remind you of some upcoming events. Later this afternoon at 4 p.m. Eastern, there's a G7 inspired panel on health data in Canada. And the program resumes tomorrow morning at 9:30 a.m. Eastern with a symposium on lessons learned from the pandemic. And that's being organized by McGill University. All of this important programming this week reflects the Royal Society of Canada's continuing commitment across disciplines and across generations. So that's a wrap for our climate change program today. Thanks again for joining us. Merci tout le monde et à bientôt.